It was supposed to be a symbol of American engineering, but it turned into a national embarrassment. And it wasn't alone. From explosive designs to deadly mistakes, these 12 cars weren't just dangerous. They were sold, driven, and trusted. Until the truth came out. These are the machines that failed their drivers and stained America's automotive legacy. The 1962-1966 Rambler American, derisively nicknamed the Tin Box on Wheels, may have been AMC's attempt to offer Americans an affordable, no-nonsense compact car during the early 1960s. But it came with safety compromises so glaring that even its price couldn't excuse them. The car was small, economical, and modestly styled, designed for families on a budget, students, and second-car buyers who didn't need performance or prestige. But unfortunately, it was also about as durable in a collision as a soda can. Structurally, the Rambler American of this era was a study in cost-cutting simplicity. AMC, trying to stretch its limited resources, used old tooling and dated engineering to keep the price low. The result was a car that weighed just over 2,400 pounds, but lacked the body rigidity and reinforcement of even its modest competitors. The doors were thin, the floor pan was flat and largely unsupported, and the A and B pillars, if present at all on some models, offered little protection in the event of a side impact. In a T-bone crash, it wasn't unusual for the impact force to penetrate well into the cabin, turning the inside of the car into a crushing metal cave. There are stories from survivors who recall being able to see moonlight through gaps in the bodywork after a relatively minor wreck. Not because parts had been torn off, but because the structure had folded it like origami. Safety features were, at best, an afterthought. Most Americans in the early 60s didn't yet demand seatbelts, and AMC was not eager to spend money on something customers weren't asking for. While optional seatbelts were available later in production, they were the simple lap belt type and were not installed in most examples. Early models had no padded dash, no energy-absorbing steering column, and the dashboard itself featured a menacing array of sharp metal edges and protruding knobs that could turn a minor collision into a trip to the emergency room. The interior wasn't just austere, it was potentially lethal. One of the Rambler American's greatest failings, however, was its response in even low-speed impacts. The thin-gauge sheet metal used in the body panels might have saved weight and cost, but it also meant that the car folded under pressure. Fender benders didn't just crumple a corner, they often bent frame rails or knocked the suspension out of alignment. Some owners even reported their cars sustaining serious drivability issues after a seemingly innocent parking lot tap. And if you were in a real accident, you might find the front of the car crumpled like a crushed beer can and the doors jammed shut, or worse, popped open entirely. Despite these critical safety concerns, the Rambler American wasn't completely devoid of charm. It had simple, boxy styling that some found quaint, especially in two-door sedan or convertible form. It came with small, efficient inline-six engines that got decent mileage for the time, and it had a certain underdog appeal, especially among AMC loyalists. It was modest transportation for modest people, and in an era where the big three were building massive land yachts, the Rambler's simplicity seemed almost European. But the problem was that it wasn't engineered like a European car. It was built to a price, not a standard. Owners liked it for being easy to fix, easy on gas, and roomy for its class. But that appreciation faded quickly when faced with the car's crash behavior. By the mid-1960s, American attitudes toward automotive safety were beginning to shift, thanks in large part to Ralph Nader's influential book, Unsafe at Any Speed, which laid bare the failures of car companies to prioritize occupant protection. The Rambler American wasn't singled out in Nader's book, but it easily could have been. It ticked nearly every box of what safety advocates were warning about: thin doors, rigid interiors, poor crash survivability, and a lack of restraint systems. Those who owned the car often described it with a mix of affection and fear. One former owner put it best: in a fender bender, it bent like a beer can. In a real crash, it folded like a beach chair. The quote captures the central issue with the Rambler American. It was lightweight, affordable, and easy to park, but once the real world intruded in the form of an accident, it left its occupants frighteningly vulnerable. Today, the Rambler American has become something of a curiosity in the world of classic cars. Collectors may seek them out for their rarity and simplicity, and AMC enthusiasts will always have a soft spot for these forgotten compact warriors. But no one buys one for its safety, and no one forgets the compromises it made. It was a product of its time, but also a symbol of how far automotive safety had to go. In the grand timeline of dangerous cars, the Rambler American didn't explode like a Pinto or catch fire like an early Fiero, but its passive neglect of structural protection earned it a quiet place on. The 1979-1981 Ford Fairmont, ominously remembered as the plastic gamble, marked a transitional moment for the American auto industry, and not in a good way. Ford was eager to introduce a new kind of modular platform that could serve as the basis for a wide range of future vehicles, and the Fairmont was their first stab at making that vision a reality. Built on the all-new Fox platform, it promised efficiency, affordability, and versatility. But what drivers got instead was a car that often felt flimsy, dangerously under-engineered, and as fragile as a plastic model kit left in the sun. On paper, the Fairmont seemed like a promising leap forward. It was Ford's first major mass-market vehicle to adopt unibody construction with modular adaptability, a revolutionary idea that would later give rise to better vehicles like the Mustang and Lincoln Continental of the 1980s. But Ford was rushing to keep up with tightening fuel economy regulations, rising competition from Japanese imports, and the fallout of the 70s oil crisis. As a result, the Fairmont was pushed to production with minimal time for real-world testing, and its flaws were baked into the very skeleton of the car. The sheet metal used in the body was alarmingly thin, and not just compared to older Detroit iron. Reports at the time noted that you could dent a door with a firm shove of the knee. Many owners experienced rust problems in less than 2 winters, especially around the rocker panels and wheel arches. Worse still, the body shell offered little real protection in an accident. In rear-end collisions, the cabin's structural integrity often failed catastrophically, with the rear crumpling deeply into the passenger compartment and pushing the fuel tank dangerously close to rupture. That's right, fuel system integrity was another Fairmont Achilles heel. Early models were plagued by poorly fitted fuel lines and leaky seals, some of which allowed gasoline vapor to accumulate under the car or around the engine bay. While the Fairmont never developed the fireball reputation of the Ford Pinto, there were enough fires and near misses reported that it scared off many buyers once word got around. Insurance companies began quietly raising premiums on them by the early 80s, a silent acknowledgement that this car had real liability issues. Another critical flaw was the door latch system. Designed to be light and inexpensive, the latches were infamous for popping open during side impacts, or worse, when the car flexed too much during hard cornering. Imagine turning into a steep driveway and hearing your rear passenger door click open. That wasn't just a hypothetical scenario, it actually happened to Fairmont owners. As one owner bitterly recalled, "It looked like a normal car, but felt like it was made of styrofoam. You slammed the door too hard and something rattled loose, and then it wouldn't shut again." Handling and performance were nothing to celebrate either. Despite being rear-wheel drive and reasonably light for its size, the Fairmont had mushy suspension, vague steering, and braking distances that bordered on alarming. Powertrain options ranged from a weak inline-4 to a wheezy 6-cylinder, and while you could option a V8, doing so overwhelmed the chassis and exposed its lack of balance and stopping power. One automotive journalist at the time remarked, "It's a car that feels like it was designed to meet minimum standards in every category, but it does nothing well." And that was the essence of the Fairmont. It wasn't disastrously awful in one specific way like the Pinto or the Vega. It was just underwhelming, unfinished, and unsafe in many little ways that added up to something greater. A car that didn't inspire confidence. It looked ordinary, promised practicality, and rode like a marshmallow on wheels. But open the hood, inspect the seams, or watch what happened in a fender bender, and the illusion of normalcy shattered. Ironically, the Fox platform that underpinned the Fairmont would go on to redeem itself in more refined and better-built vehicles. But in its first application, it gave the world a car that felt like a rushed proof of concept, one sold to the masses. Today, the Fairmont has largely disappeared from American roads, not because it was hated, but because it simply didn't last. Structurally frail, easily rusted, and forgettable in every way except its subtle dangers, the Fairmont is now a footnote in Ford history, remembered not for what it achieved, but for what it risked. The 1955-1956 Packard Clipper, grimly nicknamed the last gasp lethal luxury, stands as a tragic monument to the decline of one of America's most prestigious automakers. Once a name synonymous with excellence, elegance, and engineering prowess, Packard was on its knees by the mid-1950s. The Clipper, instead of being a triumphant return to form, became a symbol of desperate cost-cutting, compromised design, and fatal flaws that turned luxury into liability. It was a beautiful car on the surface, but under that shimmering chrome and padded upholstery was a vehicle that handled like a coffin on wheels. By 1955, Packard was running out of time and money. It had merged with Studebaker in a last-ditch attempt to stay afloat, but the merger quickly turned toxic. The financial mess at Studebaker left Packard unable to invest in all new models, so they instead hastily updated their existing lineup and introduced the Clipper as a standalone marquee for mid-market buyers, while also trying to position it as a last beacon of high-end American craftsmanship. Unfortunately, the result was a car that looked more upscale than it actually was, and beneath the shiny facade lurked a shocking disregard for handling, stopping power, and overall driving safety. The Clipper's body sat high, and its track width, the distance between left and right wheels, was unusually narrow for a car its size. This made it feel unstable, especially during emergency maneuvers or highway lane changes. The high center of gravity caused pronounced body roll, and the soft suspension made matters worse. Take a fast curve, and the car would lean to one side so hard that you felt like it might tip over. Test drivers at the time noted that the rear end felt floaty and disconnected from the rest of the car. Not a feeling you want when you're trying to maneuver over 4,000 pounds of metal at 60 mph. Worse yet, the brakes were completely outmatched by the car's weight and speed. Packard still relied on drum brakes, which suffered from extreme fade under repeated use, especially during panic stops or mountain driving. Several owners and reviewers in the day mentioned that stopping distances were terrifyingly long and unreliable, especially with a full load of passengers. A road test in 1956 recorded the Clipper's 60-0 stopping distance at nearly 180 feet, over 50 feet longer than its competitors. Once the drums got hot, you might as well be using your feet. Then there was the torsion-level suspension system, an innovative self-leveling setup that was supposed to revolutionize ride comfort. When it worked, it was genuinely impressive. The car glided over bumps and dips, adjusting its stance automatically. But when it didn't, which was often, especially as components aged, the car would lean permanently to one side or bounce uncontrollably like a lowrider on a bad day. The repair costs were enormous, and finding parts became an exercise in frustration even just a few years later. Steering was another sore point. The new power-assisted steering was so light and vague that drivers often had no idea what the front wheels were doing. At highway speeds, this became nerve-wracking. The over-assisted steering gave no road feel, making it nearly impossible to correct slides or handle windy roads with any confidence. One journalist at the time described it as piloting a riverboat with a rubber rudder. The interior, while plush and filled with stylish appointments, had its own hazards. Metal knobs, toggle switches, and steel dashboards turned minor collisions into brutal injuries. There were no seatbelts, no padded dash. In a crash, everything in the cabin became a projectile or a blade. And because the Clipper's body-on-frame construction didn't include proper crumple zones or side impact reinforcement, many of these cars folded in on themselves like soda cans in serious accidents. Survivability in rollovers or T-bone collisions was grim. If that wasn't enough, electrical issues were common. The quality of wiring and connectors declined significantly in the post-merger era, and many owners complained about flickering lights, failed gauges, and battery drain problems that left the car dead overnight. In some cases, the complicated power window and power seat systems failed in ways that trapped drivers inside the car. And yet, despite all these flaws, there was something undeniably majestic about the Clipper. Its presence was imposing, its design was elegant. It carried the last breath of a once great brand, and for a brief moment, it almost fooled people into thinking Packard still had life left in it. But under pressure, literal and figurative, the Clipper crumbled. As one former owner put it, it felt top-heavy at 40 miles per hour. At 70, it felt like a roulette wheel with seatbelts. You weren't really driving it. You were bargaining with gravity and fate. The Clipper now occupies a strange space in automotive history. Revered for its style, the 1980 to 1983 AMC Eagle Wagon, often dubbed the all-wheel accident, was a groundbreaking idea wrapped in a poorly executed package. In concept, it was a revelation. America's first true crossover, a rugged, lifted station wagon with all-wheel drive, designed for families who didn't want to give up car-like comfort just to handle snowy roads or muddy driveways. But in practice, especially in its early years, the Eagle Wagon often proved more treacherous than the terrain it was built to conquer. Mechanical failure, poor rust-proofing, and a dangerous tendency towards structural collapse earned it both a cult following and a long list of horror stories from owners. The Eagle's core innovation, its full-time all-wheel drive system, was built using a mix of AMC's existing passenger car parts and Jeep drivetrain components. The problem was, these parts weren't designed to work together under the stresses of continuous AWD operation. In the early production years, the center differential, intended to manage torque distribution between front and rear axles, was known to seize or lock unpredictably. When that happened, the vehicle would lurch or veer violently in one direction, especially under acceleration or during sharp turns. Owners reported sudden and frightening lane changes that could toss the car across traffic lanes or toward guardrails without warning. One notorious flaw involved the variable speed viscous coupling that controlled the differential action in some early AWD units. Under heavy use or temperature fluctuations, the coupling could fail, sending equal torque to all wheels regardless of traction. On icy roads, this turned a benefit into a hazard. The car no longer adjusted to grip conditions, but instead dragged one set of wheels along with the other, leading to sudden spins or uncontrollable slides. What was sold as superior traction often led drivers straight into curbs, ditches, and the backs of snowplows. Compounding the AWD drama was the Eagle's notoriously fragile steering system. The manual and power-assisted steering boxes were poorly mounted and constructed from thin castings that developed slop after only a few thousand miles. More troubling, the box's internal gears were known to strip or jam under load, sometimes mid-turn. At highway speeds, the loss of steering wasn't just inconvenient, it was life-threatening. Many drivers described terrifying episodes where they'd turn the wheel only to have the car continue straight, as if the front end had simply given up trying. And it often had. The Eagle's front subframe, designed to carry the engine, suspension, and steering rack, was inadequately rust-proofed and thinly coated with underseal. In winter states where road salt was a constant, the subframe could rust through in under 5 years. In the worst cases, it didn't just weaken, it collapsed. Entire front suspension assemblies were known to shear off while driving, sending the vehicle nose down into the pavement. For some unlucky drivers, the car's nose would suddenly drop with a sound like a gunshot, accompanied by the shriek of metal and an abrupt detour into a guardrail or snowbank. The brakes, while acceptable by early 80s standards, were overburdened by the vehicle's added weight. The AWD system and lifted suspension meant the Eagle weighed substantially more than the Concord station wagon it was based on, yet it used the same braking hardware. Fade was common, pedal feel was spongy, and uneven front-rear bias made emergency stops feel like a gamble. Under repeated braking, especially in mountainous terrain, drivers often found themselves relying more on prayer than mechanical assistance. Even the bodywork was treacherous. AMC's infamous cost-cutting meant fit and finish were poor, and corrosion was a constant menace. Fender wells rusted out in clumps. Door latches stuck or failed. Windshield seals leaked, and hoods occasionally flew open at speed due to poorly aligned catches. Rear tailgates would jam, trapping cargo or, in one recalled incident, a family dog for over 2 hours during a road trip. Yet despite all of this, the Eagle Wagon has achieved a kind of cult status. People remember it fondly as the ancestor of the modern Subaru Outback, a bold, imaginative vehicle that was simply ahead of its time. For those who lived with one, though, the experience was often closer to mechanical roulette. One former owner recounted, "Snow traction was great, until the suspension snapped and you skidded into a ditch." Others told stories of being stranded in freezing weather, wheels locked at odd angles, the drivetrain howling like a banshee, and smoke pouring from under the hood as neighbors watched in bewilderment. In retrospect, the early AMC Eagle was both a harbinger and a hazard, a brilliant idea cursed by bad execution. Its legacy lives on, not just in the modern crossover market it helped create, but in the memories of those brave enough to drive one. The 1953 Chevrolet 210 sedan, affectionately remembered for its clean lines and mid-century American charm, bore a darker nickname among those who truly understood its structural shortcomings: the steel trap. This wasn't mere hyperbole. While the 210 sedan embodied the optimism and chrome-laden swagger of early post-war America, it was also a textbook example of how automobile design in the early 1950s or prioritized aesthetics and cost over even the most basic notions of passenger safety. Safety engineering at the time was almost non-existent. Crash testing didn't yet exist in any meaningful form, and government regulation was years, even decades away. Seatbelts weren't just optional, they weren't offered at all. The interior of the 210 was a sculpted metal box filled with hard surfaces, sharp edges, and enough unforgiving trim to turn a fender bender into a scene out of a horror film. In a front-end collision, the consequences could be gruesome, especially for the driver. The pointed, non-collapsible steering column was one of the most infamous components. Mounted directly in line with the driver's chest, it served as a spear in frontal accidents, transmitting the force of impact from the front bumper straight through to the cockpit. The column would often buckle or shear at the firewall, but not before it jammed back into the driver's rib cage, causing catastrophic injury. Doctors and ambulance crews who dealt with crash victims from these cars often remarked on how lethal this feature alone could be, turning a survivable accident into a fatal one. Equally deadly was the dashboard. Made entirely of steel, without padding or cushioning, and styled with decorative ridges and embossed shapes, it offered zero energy absorption. In a crash, it acted like a horizontal guillotine. If passengers weren't thrown forward into the steering wheel or windshield, they were slammed against this sharp-edged slab of metal. The dashboard's lower edge, where many 210s had underdash radios or ashtrays, was known to cause devastating knee, femur, and abdominal injuries. One accident report from 1954 noted that a front passenger's entire lower body was crushed between the dashboard and seat edge, in what had otherwise been a relatively low-speed suburban crash. Then there was the windshield, made from early safety glass that didn't always perform as intended. In a strong impact, it often shattered into large, jagged shards, rather than the small, pebbled fragments modern laminated glass produces. The window trim itself could bend inward, creating laceration hazards that further injured occupants thrown forward by the lack of restraints. Even outside of crashes, the car's structure wasn't particularly safe. Doors lacked reinforcement beams and would sometimes fly open during a side impact or rollover. The door latches were known to pop loose under pressure, sometimes ejecting passengers or leaving them partially exposed as the car spun. Ironically, some dealers touted the car's wide-opening doors and airy cabin as a selling point for families, not realizing they were pitching a design flaw that could turn lethal in a split second. Despite all this, people loved the 210. It was stylish, relatively affordable, and reliable by early 50s standards. Its 3.9L inline-6 Blue Flame engine was torquey and easy to maintain. The car felt solid and powerful, and to many post-war Americans, it represented a kind of prosperity that was suddenly within reach. For a generation that had just endured global conflict and rationing, the 210 sedan was freedom on wheels. That its freedom came with so many hidden risks wasn't immediately obvious, at least not until accidents started piling up. Former owners who lived to tell the tale often recall their experiences with a kind of ironic affection. One once said, "It was a beautiful car until it turned into a medieval torture device during an accident." Others remember how little concern people had at the time for safety. Kids rode in the front seat, unbelted, often standing between parents. No one questioned it until tragedy struck. Today, the 1953 Chevrolet 210 sedan is a collector's piece, admired for its design, its place in history, and its snapshot of an era before regulations. But it's also a chilling reminder of how far automotive safety has come. It didn't just lack crumple zones or airbags. It lacked any pretense of survivability. It was, quite literally, a steel trap dressed up in gleaming chrome and two-tone paint, rolling into the future with the style of a jet-age cruiser and the safety of a cannonball. The 1977-1979 Dodge Magnum XE is a perfect example of what happened when the swagger of muscle car aesthetics collided with the regulatory and engineering realities of the late 1970s. Bearing the evocative nickname, the lead brick missile, the Magnum was meant to capture some of the magic and mystique of Mopar's muscle heritage. But instead, it delivered a strangely confused package, part luxury cruiser, part NASCAR wannabe, and part an automotive identity crisis. By the time the Magnum XE debuted in 1977, the golden age of muscle cars was long gone. Emissions controls, insurance hikes, fuel crises, and tightening safety laws had kneecapped the raw power of the early 70s. But Dodge still wanted a halo car, something that looked like it meant business. So they draped a sharply creased, long-hooded fastback body over the B-body platform, shared with the Cordoba, and loaded it with hidden headlights, opera windows, and enough chrome trim to blind a small town. It looked aggressive, especially in black with mag wheels, but underneath, it was something else entirely. Weighing well over 4,000 pounds when fully optioned, the Magnum XE was truly a lead brick in motion. The base engine was the 318 V8, but the optional 360, 400, and even 440 cubic inch V8s were available in the earlier years. Detuned, choked by emissions gear, and far from their muscle-bound ancestors. The big engine still made noise and torque, but it was a strained effort. Acceleration was decent in a straight line, but that was where the fun ended. The moment you threw it into a curve or needed to stop quickly, the car's true nature revealed itself. Slow, lumbering, and frighteningly imprecise. The suspension was designed more for comfort than performance, with vague steering and plenty of body roll. On uneven pavement or during hard turns, the car would lean, flex, and groan as if it were resisting the very concept of directional change. The unibody construction didn't help. Body flex was so severe that it sometimes caused misalignment between the doors and roofline. Drivers would report doors that jammed or wouldn't shut flush after only moderate driving it on twisty roads. At speed, wind noise would sneak in through poor seals, and the structure felt more like it was swaying than gripping. Braking was another issue. The standard front disc/rear drum setup wasn't up to the task of stopping something this massive with any urgency. Repeated panic stops would lead to fade, shudder, and long, uncertain stopping distances. One magazine of the time remarked that stopping this car from 70 mph is like dropping anchor, but the anchor's made of plastic. Inside, the Magnum XE tried to impress with personal luxury appointments, faux wood grain, thick carpeting, and optional crushed velour seats. But quality control was hit or miss. Dashboard components rattled, switchgear felt cheap, and climate systems were notoriously finicky. The massive hood created visibility issues, especially when trying to park or maneuver in tight spots, and the rear quarter windows and thick C-pillars turned lane changes into games of blind trust. Chrysler even attempted to lend the car performance credibility by entering it into NASCAR. Richard Petty briefly raced a Magnum in 1978, but the car's size, weight, and awkward aerodynamics proved uncompetitive. Petty quickly moved on to a Chevy Monte Carlo, leaving the Magnum to be remembered more as a curiosity than a contender. Still, for a certain kind of buyer in the late 70s, someone who missed the muscle car era but wanted something that looked mean while cruising to the disco, the Magnum had appeal. It was bold, brash, and carried just enough engine rumble to make you believe it could do more than it actually could. The car drew stares but rarely praise from anyone behind the wheel. One former owner summed it up with a wince. It wanted to be a muscle car, but handled like a drunk refrigerator. That line perfectly captures the car's dual nature. It had muscle car flair, scooped hood, sloped fastback, hidden lights, but the performance just wasn't there. It looked ready to fight, but moved like it was half asleep and bloated from Thanksgiving dinner. Today, the Magnum XC has become something of a forgotten footnote in Mopar history. Loved by some for its looks and rarity, derided by others for how far short it fell of the legends that preceded it. It was the muscle car as remembered through a hazy lens of nostalgia, choked by regulations, and executed with more hope than finesse. A visual powerhouse with a soul dulled by the times. The lead brick missile, indeed. The 1960 and 1962 Plymouth Valiant, often dubbed the shaky experiment, was one of Chrysler's boldest departures from conventional automotive design at the dawn of the 1960s, and for better or worse, it showed. Born from necessity during a time when Detroit's Big Three were scrambling to answer the growing threat of compact imports, like the Volkswagen Beetle and Renault Dauphine, the Valiant was meant to be Plymouth's forward-looking answer. Smaller, lighter, more efficient, and more technologically sophisticated. And while it was certainly ambitious, the first-generation Valiant was also plagued with a troubling mix of innovation and instability. The Valiant introduced Americans to a striking and polarizing new aesthetic. With its sharply creased lines, large grille, and sculpted flanks, it looked nothing like its rounded, chrome-laden contemporaries. Virgil Exner's forward-look styling went full tilt here. Some thought it was futuristic, others thought it looked like a spaceship crash-landed on a Rambler. Either way, it turned heads, but underneath its sheet metal was where the real gamble lay. Chrysler engineers built the Valiant on an all-new unibody platform, a daring move at the time. This construction saved weight and manufacturing costs, and it gave the car a more modern feel. The front suspension was equally revolutionary, a torsion bar setup that replaced traditional coil springs. The goal was improved ride quality and handling precision. In theory, it worked. In practice, at least in those early years, the execution didn't quite match the vision. The lightweight unibody structure, while conceptually solid, flexed noticeably under stress. On uneven roads or during cornering, the body would twist enough to affect alignment, door fitment, and even steering geometry. This flexing sometimes caused doors to creak or even stick, and in some cases the windshield seals began to leak after repeated frames of stress. Drivers reported that after hitting a large pothole or railroad crossing, the car would begin to pull under braking, an issue stemming from the altered suspension geometry and misaligned front end. As for the torsion bar suspension, it was brilliant in design but needed more development time. When new, the ride was relatively smooth and flat, but the bars sagged quickly with use, especially when paired with the Valiant's small, underdamped shocks. Owners noticed the front end sitting lower than designed after only a few years, and handling became twitchy. Add in narrow bias-ply tires and a light rear end, and you had a recipe for unpredictable behavior, especially in wet conditions. Braking wasn't much better. The standard drum brakes were barely up to the task, and the lightweight body meant the car could dart or pull to one side under hard braking. There were stories of owners making an emergency stop only to find themselves halfway into another lane as the steering wheel pointed in one direction while the car drifted another. As one frustrated Valiant owner put it, one pothole in the steering wheel pointed west while the car went north. Interior fit and finish didn't inspire confidence either. The dash was hard steel with minimal padding, and early seatbelt options were rare to non-existent. The economy-focused cabin used thin plastics and vinyl that cracked in the sun, and many owners recalled rattles and squeaks setting in not long after purchase. Even the push-button automatic transmission controls, a clever innovation, were sometimes glitchy, requiring firm presses or multiple tries to get the gear selected. Despite all this, the Valiant wasn't a total failure. In fact, many praised its economical slant-six engine, which proved to be the most reliable part of the car. That rugged 170 or optional 225 cubic inch inline six had enough low-end torque and durability to outlast the rest of the vehicle, and it would go on to power Mopars for decades. But the rest of the package, especially in the first generation, never quite lived up to its engineering promise. Today, the 1960-1962 Valiant is remembered as both a visionary step forward and a cautionary tale. It showed that Detroit was capable of bold innovation, but also that first attempts at revolution rarely go smoothly. The shaky experiment, as it's come to be called by enthusiasts and critics alike, was an early attempt to future-proof Plymouth's lineup. And while it looks sharp on the showroom floor, it sometimes felt like it was held together more by ideas than by bolts. It was quirky, it was gutsy, and in many ways it was ahead of its time. But if you owned one, especially brand new, chances are you also became familiar with front-end shops, wheel alignments, and the occasional unplanned lane change. The 1975 to 1977 Chevrolet Chevet, affectionately or not so affectionately known as the Death Vet, was a stark reminder of what happens when automakers cut corners in pursuit of affordability. The Chevet was Chevrolet's answer to the growing demand for compact, fuel-efficient cars, especially in the wake of the 1973 oil crisis. On paper, it seemed like a reasonable response. Small, lightweight, inexpensive, and practical. However, when you got behind the wheel, it quickly became apparent that cost-cutting had compromised nearly every aspect of the vehicle's safety and performance. From the outset, the Chevet was underpowered. The early models were equipped with a tiny 1.6-liter four-cylinder engine, which, on paper, promised decent fuel economy. But in practice, it had barely enough power to move the car out of its own way. With just 53 horsepower, the Chevet felt sluggish on the road, especially when loaded with passengers or climbing hills. Trying to accelerate on the highway was an exercise in patience as the car struggled to reach even moderate speeds. It was clear that the Chevet was not built for performance, and that's something that would have been forgivable had it not been for the other problems that plagued it. What made the Chevet truly dangerous was its shocking lack of structural integrity. The thin metal used for the body panels gave the car a tinny feel, and its doors were so flimsy that they seemed to bend upon contact. In side impacts, the lack of proper crumple zones and side impact protection meant that a minor collision could easily translate into significant injury. The lack of any substantial reinforcement meant that the Chevet's frame didn't absorb shock in the way that more thoughtfully designed cars did, often leaving passengers vulnerable in even minor fender benders. There was also an utter lack of crash safety features. No airbags, no reinforced side panels, and, in the case of some early models, the seatbelts themselves were an afterthought, offering minimal protection. Then there were the bumpers, which were little more than decorative afterthoughts in terms of functionality. They were weak, poorly designed, and incapable of withstanding even the slightest impact. A simple tap from another vehicle or even a shopping cart was enough to cause noticeable damage to the Chevet's exterior, while the bodywork itself was susceptible to rust after only a few years of exposure to the elements. In fact, many Chevets were known to develop significant body rot in the wheel wells and along the fenders within just a few years, making the car not only dangerous but unreliable as well. Perhaps the most glaring safety issue was the Chevet's seats. While they were designed to be lightweight and inexpensive, they were prone to collapsing in the event of an accident. The seats lacked proper support and were attached to the floor with weak mounts that would often fail in collisions, leaving drivers and passengers vulnerable to injury. One of the most common complaints among early Chevet owners was how the seats would tip back or break upon impact, turning a minor fender bender into a potentially fatal event. On top of all this, the car's handling was far from reassuring. The suspension system was basic, offering little in terms of comfort or stability. The Chevet was notorious for its loose, sloppy steering, which made it prone to swaying and drifting on the highway, especially at higher speeds. Drivers often found themselves overcompensating when steering to keep the car in a straight line, and it was common for the rear end to lose traction in wet or slippery conditions. Simply put, the Chevet was a car that felt like it was barely keeping itself together, especially on anything other than smooth, flat roads. But what perhaps summed up the Chevet's reputation best was the infamous quote from an owner who experienced a shopping cart denting the car's fender. "Imagine what a pickup truck could do." The Chevet's lightweight build and flimsy construction made it highly vulnerable to even the most minor impacts, which was especially dangerous considering the increasingly congested roads and highways of the time. A small fender bender could result in significant damage, while a more serious accident could have catastrophic consequences, leaving occupants with little to no protection. The Chevet's reputation as a death trap was cemented as time went on. The combination of poor build quality, lack of safety features, and underpowered performance made it one of the least regarded vehicles of the era. While the car did serve its purpose as an affordable, fuel-efficient vehicle, it failed miserably when it came to protecting its occupants in the event of a crash. The term death vet became a fitting nickname, as it was a car that seemed to put its drivers and passengers at risk with every mile driven. The 1959 Cadillac Series 62, often referred to by the nickname the Chrome Battleship, is a landmark in the history of automotive design. It stands as one of the most extravagant and visually striking cars ever created, epitomizing the peak of 1950s luxury, chrome excess, and the desire for automotive grandeur. At the height of the tailfin craze, Cadillac took these design cues to the extreme with the 1959 Series 62, a car that was both revered and feared. Its tailfins, longer than any that had come before them, were nothing short of outrageous. But while the car's aesthetic appeal was undeniable, its safety flaws were dangerously overlooked, resulting in a vehicle that, while breathtaking in looks, was often hazardous to its occupants. The tail fins, which have since become synonymous with 1950s automotive styling, were not just decorative flourishes, but massive pointed protrusions that gave the car an imposing, almost futuristic presence. From a design standpoint, they were meant to evoke a sense of speed and elegance, giving the car an otherworldly, jet-age appearance. However, in the real world, those same fins posed a serious danger. In side-impact collisions, they could easily impale pedestrians or other vehicles, turning a minor fender bender into a horrific scenario. The sharp, unyielding edges of the fins could slice through anything that came in contact with them, making the car a threat on the road, not just in terms of its size, but its deadly design. The fins weren't the only safety hazard present in the Series 62, however. The dashboard, designed to exude luxury with its rich materials and trim, contained sharp-edged metal surfaces that would become a serious danger in the event of a crash. While many cars at the time still had rudimentary interiors, Cadillac took the idea of luxury to new extremes, forgetting that in a high-speed collision, that same luxury could turn lethal. A passenger in the front seat could be impaled by the sharp dashboard, and the absence of padding or crumple zones meant there was very little protection for the occupants. What was meant to create an air of wealth and sophistication in the cabin instead made it a potential death trap. The 1959 Cadillac Series 62's massive size, another hallmark of 1950s car design, was both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, large cars were often seen as more protective due to their sheer mass, which led many to believe that the weight of the Cadillac would shield its passengers in the event of a crash. However, in reality, the car's weight made it difficult to control, especially in emergency situations. When combined with its ponderous handling and cumbersome steering, the car became much more difficult to maneuver, even at lower speeds. A car that could have benefited from modern suspension systems and better brakes instead featured a suspension that was not equipped to handle the immense weight of the car effectively. The braking system, while adequate for normal driving conditions, often faltered under high-speed stress, resulting in extended stopping distances and an increased risk of collision. Handling was yet another area where the Series 62 fell short. Despite being a car built for comfort and smooth cruising, it was not built for quick, evasive action. The steering system, while fine under normal conditions, was not responsive enough to make sharp maneuvers safely. As a result, the Series 62 was more likely to lose control in an emergency situation, particularly on sharp curves or when swerving to avoid an obstacle. Despite its graceful appearance, the car's weight and suspension setup made it more prone to oversteering, further contributing to the danger. Despite all these glaring flaws, the 1959 Cadillac Series 62 remained one of the most beautiful cars ever made, its massive tail fins and chrome details embodying the epitome of 1950s excess. However, the reality was that its beautiful design came at a cost, and that cost was the safety of its passengers. While it may have been a jaw-dropping symbol of wealth and status, it also served as a cautionary tale of an era when style too often overshadowed substance. A car that could easily be admired from a distance could, in the blink of an eye, become a rolling hazard. And while it is still revered today for its iconic looks, the legacy of the 1959 Cadillac Series 62 is also one of missed opportunities. A stunning car that could have been both beautiful and safe, but instead became a symbol of an era when the priority was on luxury, not crash safety. It's difficult to overstate the impact the Series 62 had on the American automotive scene. In its time, the car was seen as the pinnacle of design, with tail fins reaching new heights in terms of automotive style. However, in the aftermath of accidents and rising awareness of car safety in the 1960s and beyond, the shortcomings of cars like the Cadillac became painfully clear. The 1971 to 1973 Mercury Capri, sold in the U.S. under the tagline "The Euro Lottery," represents a fascinating but ultimately tragic case of missed potential in the world of automotive engineering. Imported from Ford of Europe, this compact sports coupe had high hopes of carving out a niche in the American market as an affordable, European-style alternative to the larger American muscle cars that dominated the era. It offered a sleek, sporty design, a peppy engine, and a relatively low price tag, all attractive features in an increasingly competitive market. Unfortunately, it quickly became clear that, while it was an attractive option, the Capri was deeply flawed when it came to meeting the demands of U.S. consumers, specifically in terms of safety and long-term durability. The most glaring oversight in the design of the U.S. version of the Mercury Capri was the lack of crash safety considerations. The vehicle was originally designed for European markets, where crash standards were different, often less stringent than those in the United States. Ford, in a rush to capitalize on the Capri's European success, did little to adapt it for the tougher crash regulations that were emerging in the U.S. at the time. As a result, the Mercury Capri had virtually no reinforcement in its doors or floor. The thin metal used for the body panels made the car incredibly susceptible to structural failure in the event of a crash. A minor side impact could easily crush the door and intrude into the passenger compartment, offering little protection to the occupants. In a more severe collision, the car's flimsy structure was likely to collapse entirely, making it feel like a death trap on wheels. The steering components were another weak point. The brittle, under-engineered parts often failed, leading to a loss of steering control, which could prove disastrous, particularly in emergency situations. The risk of steering failure became a major safety concern, as the car's fragile steering column could lock up unexpectedly or fail entirely. Imagine trying to avoid a collision in a vehicle that could suddenly lose its ability to steer. This was a terrifying reality for those who drove the Capri during its brief stint in the American market. But even if the car's design had been solid in terms of its basic structural integrity, the Mercury Capri had another fatal flaw: rust. The U.S. version of the Capri was poorly rust-proofed, which meant that over time the car's body would begin to deteriorate from the inside out. Structural rot often set in after just a few years, compromising both the car's safety and its durability. The lack of rust protection, coupled with the overall poor build quality, made it highly prone to frame corrosion. This structural decay would result in weakened body panels and compromised safety features, rendering the car almost useless for daily driving after only a few short years on the road. The combination of flimsy construction, inadequate crash safety, brittle components, and rust issues made the Mercury Capri an unreliable, unsafe choice for American drivers. While the car may have looked stylish on the outside with its European flair and sporty appearance, it offered very little protection in the event of an accident. In fact, it was so poorly equipped to handle the demands of U.S. road safety that even a small deer strike could result in total loss. A serious collision, on the other hand, could obliterate the car and leave no trace. The Mercury Capri's reputation as the Euro lottery was rooted in the harsh reality that while it had the appearance of a sleek European import, it lacked the safety features that were essential for American roads, particularly in an era when U.S. consumers were becoming more aware of the need for vehicles with stronger safety features. For those who drove the Capri, the experience was one of high risk for low reward. The car may have been fun to drive with its sporty handling and compact size, but it was a gamble when it came to safety. Those who were fortunate enough to avoid accidents could appreciate its peppy performance and stylish design, but for others, the car was a nightmare waiting to happen. Many owners reported terrifying experiences on the road, where they felt completely exposed and vulnerable, knowing that their car offered no real protection. In many ways, the 1971-1973 Mercury Capri serves as a reminder of the pitfalls of importing vehicles from markets where safety standards are different from those in the U.S. The car may have won over fans with its European design and youthful appeal, but it ultimately failed to meet the standards required for the American market. The Mercury Capri's design flaws left it susceptible to failure in both performance and safety, and it remains one of those vehicles that looks appealing on paper but proves to be a dangerous and unreliable choice in practice. The 1968-1970 Chevrolet Kingswood wagon, fondly nicknamed the Family Missile, was a classic example of 1960s automotive excess. Designed to carry a large family, their luggage, and all the leisure gear they could possibly fit. On paper, it sounded like the perfect family vehicle, with its spacious interior, big block V8 engine, and enough room for just about anything you could want to haul. But when it came to safety, the Kingswood was an absolute disaster waiting to happen. Its combination of sheer power, heavy weight, and inadequate safety features turned this otherwise practical station wagon into a ticking time bomb on wheels. At the heart of the Kingswood was its massive engine, a V8 capable of producing plenty of horsepower, which was more than enough to push the wagon down the road with surprising speed for such a large vehicle. This was the epitome of American muscle in the form of a family car. The problem, however, was that the wagon's sheer power came with no consideration for the importance of handling or braking. While the Kingswood could accelerate with the best of them, it was a different story when it came to stopping. The brakes were woefully underpowered for the car's size and weight, often leading to dangerously long stopping distances, especially when fully loaded. Given that the Kingswood was frequently used as a family hauler, often carrying kids, camping gear, and other heavy loads, this was an enormous safety risk. Add to that the wagon's high rollover risk, particularly during sudden maneuvers or sharp turns, and you had a vehicle that was anything but family-friendly. In an era before mandatory seatbelt laws, the Kingswood was equipped with minimal seatbelt protection, making it a hazardous place for anyone inside. A sudden stop or crash could send passengers, especially unbelted children, careening through the cabin, causing injuries or worse. Even those who did manage to buckle up were often left with poorly designed restraint systems that lacked modern safety features like adjustable shoulder straps or airbags. In fact, if you were to get into a serious crash in the Kingswood, the results could be catastrophic. The lack of proper restraint systems and poor crashworthiness meant that a collision could easily result in devastating injuries, especially if the vehicle rolled over. The Kingswood's handling was another area where it failed dramatically. While it was powerful and fast in a straight line, taking corners or sharp turns was another matter entirely. The combination of its heavy weight, poor suspension, and lack of modern handling technology made the Kingswood feel clumsy on the road, especially when loaded down with passengers and gear. At high speeds or during evasive maneuvers, the vehicle had a terrifying tendency to tip and slide, making it difficult to control in tight situations. The wagon's design lacked modern stability control features, which made it prone to oversteering and dangerous body roll. If the driver wasn't careful, the Kingswood could easily end up in a spin, with the car's high center of gravity only exacerbating the risk of a rollover. As if these factors weren't enough, the Kingswood's structural integrity left much to be desired. It was a heavy vehicle, to be sure, but that weight wasn't distributed well for safety. In the event of a collision, the car's flimsy construction would collapse much more easily than a modern vehicle, creating a scenario in which the safety of the occupants was severely compromised. In addition, the rear of the Kingswood, designed to carry cargo, had no crumple zone or crash structure to speak of, meaning that if the car was rear-ended, the impact would travel directly into the cabin, a deadly situation, especially for passengers sitting in the back. Despite all its shortcomings, the Kingswood was undeniably a stylish and capable vehicle for its time. The powerful V8 engine, expansive cargo space, and the general appeal of American full-size cars in the 1960s made it a popular choice for families looking to travel in comfort. However, its lack of modern safety features, poor handling, and tendency to become uncontrollable in critical situations made it a high-risk proposition for any family using it as their primary mode of transportation. The family missile nickname wasn't just a jab at its speed, but also an acknowledgement of how unpredictable and dangerous this massive, under-engineered vehicle could be. It was a reminder of a time when muscle car enthusiasm often overshadowed the consideration of safety and practicality in family vehicles. For many owners, the Kingswood was a thrilling ride, but for others, it was a horrifying reminder of how little was understood about crash safety in those days. Given its lack of modern restraint systems, poor crash protection, and dangerous handling characteristics, it's no wonder that this full-size wagon earned such a notorious moniker. The 1970-1972 Ford LTD Bugam, affectionately dubbed the Wheezing Whale, was a high-end American full-size sedan caught in the tumultuous years of the smog-era regulations. While it was designed to offer a smooth and luxurious ride, its legacy has become more defined by its mechanical problems than its comfort. In an era where emissions regulations were tightening, Ford attempted to comply with the new standards by installing cumbersome emissions equipment on the LTD Bugam's powerful V8 engines, resulting in a car that struggled to deliver on the performance and reliability it was known for. Underneath the polished exterior and plush interior of the LTD Bugam lay a far less glamorous reality. The emissions equipment added to meet the new environmental standards was a problem from the start. The complex systems designed to filter out pollutants created significant strain on the engine. The result was a noticeable loss of performance. The once powerful V8 now seemed sluggish and underpowered. Its smooth acceleration choked by the very equipment intended to improve air quality. But that wasn't the worst of it. As the emissions systems worked overtime to clean the exhaust gases, they created additional heat under the hood. This extra heat, in turn, made the engine bay an increasingly hazardous place. Overheating became a frequent issue, and under extreme conditions, the added heat would lead to engine fires. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a regular occurrence in some models, leaving owners with the terrifying thought that their luxury sedan could burst into flames without warning. The idea of driving a car that could potentially combust at any moment made the LTD Bugam's luxurious reputation look foolish and reckless. The problems with the LTD Bugam weren't just confined to the engine. The steering system, often plagued by fluid leaks, made control a guessing game. A leaking steering fluid line could cause the car to suddenly become impossible to steer, leading to dangerous situations when navigating tight corners or heavy traffic. It wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was a critical issue that could easily result in a loss of control. And if that wasn't enough, the car's braking system was equally unreliable. The same issues with leaking fluids and a struggling engine that hindered the car's acceleration also affected its ability to stop effectively, making the vehicle a ticking time bomb on the road. While the Ford LTD Bugam's luxury features, including plush seating, a smooth ride, and a high-end interior, should have made it a pleasure to drive, the reality was that these features were overshadowed by its mechanical failures. What could have been a comfortable, status-enhancing vehicle instead became a source of frustration for its owners, who were left wondering which part of the car would fail first: the engine, the steering, or the brakes. The nickname the Wheezing Whale is an apt description of the car's performance. Like a whale struggling to breathe through smog, the LTD Bugam wheezed its way through life, constantly fighting against the restrictions placed on it by the emission systems that were meant to protect the environment. But instead of offering the smooth, powerful driving experience that Ford had promised, it left drivers gasping for breath as they dealt with the constant fear of breakdowns, fires, and total mechanical failure. Ultimately, the 1970-1972 Ford LTD Bugam represents a time when cars were caught between the demands of performance and the newly imposed environmental regulations. It's a reminder of how the rush to meet new standards often led to hasty, poorly executed designs, leaving consumers with cars that couldn't live up to their promises. The LTD Bugam may have been a status symbol in its day, but for anyone who owned one, it quickly became a headache on wheels, a luxury car that couldn't even make it out of the driveway without potentially catching fire or losing control.